Welcome to session 93 of the Worlds of Speculative Fiction. We are in this session going to be finishing up with volume 2, which is the final 2 books of David Edding's Belgariad, a 5-book series, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. If this is something new for you, if you haven't been in one of these Worlds of Speculative Fiction sessions previously, let me tell you a little bit about it. So this is a series now in its 10th year, originally meeting face-to-face in a local library here in the Milwaukee area, specifically the Brookfield Public Library. And it was an opportunity to have a monthly get-together and talk about a narrative world and philosophical themes within a particular author's series of either short stories or novels or both. So worlds, we're looking at world building and how that world is unpacked and explained and its relation to plot and character and theme. And we also delve into metaphysical, ethical, aesthetic, other philosophical and literary themes that are woven into the work. We often will talk as well about what the author has to say about their own work, sometimes look at what critics have had to say as well, or the influences that the author has exerted on others. So in the case of David Edding's, we've got somebody who's been pretty influential in the fantasy world, perhaps less so recently. I would say, doing some background research, that these have been read by many people who are older when they came out in the 1980s or were recommended in the 1990s. But they're also being read by younger people, often now under the guise of young adult, a category that did exist in the 80s but wasn't quite the massive body of work that it now is. And this is a very interesting, coherent, tightly written, I would say, set of fairly short novels that can all be bundled together, all 5 of them, into 2 volumes like we have here. So we're doing something a little bit different in this session. In the past, I have looked at some pretty extensive sets of novels, for example, Terry Pratchett's Discworld or Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, where we've got, dozens and dozens of works, and we'd look at some of them, and then we'd leave it alone for a while, and then come back the next year and look at some more of them. Well, with this, our last session was on the first 3 books of the Belgariad, all found together in this volume, Pawn of Prophecy, Queen of Sorcery, and Magician's Gambit. And it leaves off not quite on a cliffhanger, but, on an important cusp of things. This session, immediately following, we are going to be looking at the final 2 volumes, bringing everything together, Castle of Wizardry, Enchanter's Endgame. Now, of course, this is not the complete end of this narrative world, or even the characters involved in it. Eddings and his collaborator and wife, who certainly was involved in these, Lay, would go on to write another 5-book series set in the same narrative universe, and then 2 standalone prequels, and later on would publish this, the Riven Codex, which you might be tempted to dig into to decipher the fuller meaning of these earlier books. Interestingly, this is much later, but the materials in it are essentially the sketches done about the different peoples, their religions, their histories, their narratives, their interesting interactions, written before Eddings begins his work in earnest on the Belgariad. So we're not going to be referencing the Riven Codex much, but if you're interested in like backstory and stuff, you might want to check it out. And we're not really going to be referencing much of anything from the first 3 books because we are going to be concentrating on the final 2 books, Castle of Wizardry and Enchanter's Endgame. And these begin in interesting ways, in the same ways that the others did, with little prologues. We're going to talk about those in just a bit. We're also going to look in this session at, Eddings didn't give many interviews, but we have some interesting bits of one that has been widely publicized that we'll look at, and we'll also look at some of the criticism, both positive and negative, of the series that you can find out there on the internet, not just to review that stuff, but because we're interested in what good questions do the criticisms, positive or negative, raise for us. For example, is the handling of prophecy, fate, determinism, freedom, is it actually interesting, coherent, or is it just kind of sloppy writing, as some people will say? And there's a lot of other things. One that I think is particularly important that we're definitely going to look at a bit later, is there actual character development, or are these kind of stock characters? And I will argue for the first by reference to the actual works themselves and what's happening in them. So we're not going to look at biography because we did that last time, and we're also not going to be discussing one of the disturbing aspects of David and Leigh Edding's biography, which is their arrest and imprisonment for child abuse back in 1970, long before he writes the Belgariad. We've already talked about that in the previous session. If that's what you're really interested in, maybe go back to the previous video and check that out. We're going to be concentrating on what is happening as the series is being brought to what I would say is a pretty successful close, with a lot of very interesting dialogue and depth involved in it, or articulated within it. So if you are a fan of this series, that's great. Hope that this spurs you to reread it, maybe think about it in some different ways. If you haven't read the Belgariad and you like fantasy, I think you probably will want to read it, and hopefully this will encourage you to do so. I will say, however, there are going to be spoilers because we can't adequately discuss the matters that are going on without talking about how the books end and why they end the way that they do and what goes on within these works. So if you don't like spoilers, this is probably where you want to stop. If you're cool with that, if you're the kind of person who, even with spoilers, can read a set of novels and get something out of it, then come along on the journey. And we're now going to jump into something that's really quite important, world building, and then we'll look at some criticism, and then we'll talk about philosophical themes. Eddings had already done a lot of world building before he began actually embarking on the process of writing this 5-book series of the Belgariad. So you could say that he's doing less world building and more world exploration in these final two books, Castle of Wizardry and Enchanter's Endgame. But there are still some interesting twists that we get. As usual with the first three books, what we get is a lot of sections in each of these that are titled after the lands in which they're happening. So in Castle of Wizardry, we start out in Algaria, and then we move from there, one of the places of the west, as far west as we can get, to the Isle of Riva, where Belgariad is going to become the new Riven king and take over from the Stuarts, who have been, essentially keeping the place going the entire time. There he's going to get engaged to Kenedra. We're going to talk a bit more about that later. Then, as Garion finds out that he has to face Torak alone or with a few companions, or with an entire army if he wishes to, he decides to take off and goes with his grandfather, Belgarath, a.k.a. Wolf, and Silk, and they go to Drosnia, where Silk is one of the nobility, right? And they make their way all the way across that, and you can see on the map that they're going from the far west into the east. Why? Because there has to be a final confrontation, and it's going to be on the ground of Torak's people, the Angaraks, and not just a little ways in, but all the way to the other side, the other continent, so to speak. So we get Drosnia, and then in Castle of Wizardry, we have a very interesting set of chapters called The Riven Queen. So that's not titled, I suppose it is kind of titled after a location, but what she's doing, Kenedra, is, along with, many other allies, gathering an entire army of the Westerners to take east to fight against the Angaraks and Torak, to create a diversion, right? And so we're going to see that there's a lot of different peoples brought in on this, the various Aelorns, some of the other people. She's going to, by the end of that part of the work, manage to recruit a number of legions from the empire that she is a princess of, that her father is the emperor of. There's going to be a few other places that are, sitting out neutral, but what we're getting here is a girding up for war. And then, as things are going to heat up in the final volume, we're moving into other places, right? So in Enchanter's Endgame, we go to Gar Og Nadrak. So it's worth remembering the bad guys to the east. They are composed of several different peoples who don't all get along with each other. They're all oriented towards this, essentially sleeping, devastated god Torak, who turns out to be incredibly evil. And we have, you could say, certain occupational groups that are living in entire kingdoms. So in the north, we've got the Nadraks, and they are sort of the merchant class. And they're a little less interested in this big war against the Westerners. They also don't trust the other groups. They don't have any problem really with the Thals. We'll talk about them in a moment. But they don't trust the Murgos at all, this great warrior group to the very far south who we encountered in the previous books. And they really don't trust the Malorians, who are further east and have been, potentially taking over their kingdom. So, they will actually wind up, becoming, you could say, neutral in some ways. And the party of three is crossing their lands. Then we're going to get this interesting whole section in Mishrak Ak Thul. So the Thuls are stuck in between the Nadraks and the Murgos. The Thuls are like the commoner class, and they are preyed upon by not only the Murgos, but also by, even more so, the Grolums, who are sacrificing them constantly to Torak. As a matter of fact, Thul women try to remain pregnant as often as they can so that they don't get sacrificed. Everybody lives under the fear of that. They're not very good fighters. And this is where a really important stratagem is going to happen. Which is going to lead to a big, big battle that's taking place. What they do is they've got these long ships that the Cherok's have, and the stratagem is to portage these ships a good ways from the end of one river to the beginning of another river, over mountains, sail them down, go into this sea that separates the two continents, and begin preying upon the troop transports and all these other things coming from Meloria. Meanwhile, the Melorians and the Murgos, both of their rulers are trying to jockey for position, for primacy among the Angaraks. So we've got a lot of really interesting stuff happening across the realm. And by the fifth, even in the fourth, but in the fifth novel, we're getting some pretty big battle scenes taking place. And we come back to another portion of the story, picking up Garion's mission. Part 3 of it is happening in Meloria, which is on the other side of the Sea of the East. This is where a few of the party, including Erend and Pol and Kenedra and the Smith, have all been taken. And this is where the final confrontation is going to take place. And it's not a very long section, but it's happening in the heart of things. Some of it in the Dark City itself. And then we have finally, after this is all over, the Isle of the Winds. And that's the epilogue where things are finally getting sorted out. So I'm not going to talk an awful lot more than I already have about where they're going and what's happening, other than to say that we've got some really interesting descriptions of landscape, of battle scenes, impressions that people are giving. I do want to bring up one thing, though. So while they're in Gar Agnadrak, there's going to be a new people introduced. So they are going to go across the lands of the Morindim, and Garion is going to ask about them, and we're actually going to get to see some magician fighting going on, involving some demons as well. So Garion asks, well, who are the Morindim, grandfather? Everyone keeps talking about them as if they are terribly dangerous. They are, Belgarath replied, but you can get through their country if you're careful. Are they on Torak's side? The Morindim aren't on anybody's side. They don't even live in the same world with us. I don't follow that. The Morindim are like the Ulgos used to be before all accepted them. There were several groups of godless ones. They all wandered off in various directions. The Ulgos went to the west. The Morindim went north. Other groups went south or east and disappeared. Why couldn't they just stay where they were? They couldn't. There's a kind of compulsion involved in the decisions of the gods. Anyway, the Ulgos finally found themselves a god. The Morindim didn't. The compulsion to remain separated from other people is still there. They live in the treeless emptiness up there beyond the North Range. Small nomadic bands mainly. What did you mean when you said they didn't live in the same world with us? The world is a terrible place for a Morand, a demon-haunted place. They worship devils and they live more in dreams than they do in reality. Their society is dominated by the dreamers and magicians. There aren't really any devils, Garion asked skeptically. Oh, yes. The devils are very real. Where do they come from? Belgariad said, I haven't any idea. They do exist, though, and they're completely evil. The Mondarim control them by use of magic. Now, notice we're going to get another interesting reflection here of what's going on in the world. And he says, magic, is that different from what we do? Quite a bit. We're sorcerers, at least that's what we're called. What we do involves the will and the word, but that's not the only way to do things. I don't quite follow. It's not really all that complicated, Garion. There are several ways to tamper with the normal order of things. Vorda is a witch. What she does involves the use of spirits, usually benign, mischievous sometimes, but not actually wicked. A magician uses devils, evil spirits. Isn't that sort of dangerous? Belgariad nodded. Very dangerous. The magician tries to control the demon with spells, formulas, incantations, symbols, mystic diagrams, that sort of thing. As long as he doesn't make any mistakes, the demon is his absolute slave and has to do what he tells it to. The demon doesn't want to be a slave, so it keeps looking for a way to break the spell. What happens if it does? It generally devours the magician on the spot. This happens rather frequently. If you lose your concentration or summon a demon too strong for you, you're in trouble. What did Belden mean when he said you weren't very good at magic? Silk asked. I've never spent that much time trying to learn about it, the old sorcerer replied. I have alternatives, and after all, magic is dangerous and not very dependable, right? And so they travel through the land, it basically in disguise, and there is a confrontation between the sorcerer and a magician, and it doesn't turn out well for the magician, and then they cross the land bridge way up north, and then they are going to be in Maloria. So, very interesting exploration of a world already to a significant extent created and outlined, but then needing to be explored, explained with a few new additions of peoples along the way. As those who follow and even participate in this series, Worlds of Speculative Fiction, know, I like to try to get interviews or essays by an author explaining what it is that they're up to, their point of view on their work, and I sometimes also like to look at critical essays that have been put out there about the author's work. As it turns out, other than the Riven Codex, which is mostly source material, we don't have an awful lot by way of interviews or self-regarding essays by David Edding, but I will conclude this section by looking at one interview that I think is somewhat helpful. We do have a good bit of interesting examinations of his work, some very positive, some rather negative, and I think it's sort of inevitable when you have somebody whose works get recommended still down to the present, but who is writing in an earlier period. So he's not like, a contemporary fantasy author, that you're going to get an interesting wide range of responses to his work. Some people rereading it and giving their verdict. I read it when I was a kid, and now here's what I think as an adult many years later, or people reading it for the first time and sometimes measuring it by what we could call the standards, the criteria, the benchmarks of contemporary fantasy. So I'm going to begin with an actual fairly positive review, and we'll look at some other ones that are less so, and I'll have some things to say along the way myself, some of which will be me agreeing and some of which will be me registering why I disagree with their verdict. So the first one is by Jeff Matthews, and it's called The Belgariad Over 30. And so he writes, the books, the first 5 that make The Belgariad, are over 30 years old and still in print. There are many a book and series that has gone out of print in that time. Clearly, this series has long-term appeal. People are still buying it and journeying through the world of prophecy. The Belgariad is not grim dark. Thank the deity of your choice for that. There are for you gore fiends and lovers of treachery, self-indulgence and selfishness, some ugly scenes in the books, and he lists a number of those. And he says, there is a feeling of disgust and sorrow raised in the characters who witness these scenes. No one shrugs it off, but it determines their actions in the future and reaffirms their desire. However, there is humor on top that carries through many of the scenes and chapters. Let me be clear and state my own bias here. I'm a human who believes we can be a better species. We can treat each other with respect and kindness, that our future is not one of constant wars of religion, resources, and wealth. At some point, we will put differences aside and create a better world. And you may say, he's a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Darkness begets darkness. We need to see the light, and I'd be prepared to meet anyone inside the ring to argue that even grimdark has a light within it somewhere. Most of the time, it has to have hope, or what is the point? Then he goes on and he says, and I think I agree with this, at the heart of the Belgariad is relationships, not desire and lust, but love. It echoes all the way through the series. Here is a family, extended and full of friendships, that functions. They argue at times, but they forgive and understand. One of my friends and fellow fantasy mod on the Facebook page mentioned how everyone hugs it out, and he's right. But I'll tell you this. When my own family argue, kids blow a gasket at being asked to clean their rooms, for instance, it is all forgiven and ends in a hug. That's what families do. Care, argue, love, forgive, and move on. And then he says, you find you just want to spend more time with the cast of the Belgariad. I'd give anything to sit in a tavern and listen to Mr. Wolf tell a story of the past. Listen to the kings bicker and complain, then get drunk on ale, practice archery with Lendoran, or help Garion learn to use his powers. Go on a business trip with Silk, or eat food cooked by Aunt Pole. I remember the first time I finished Book 5 before the Malloreon had been released, and I was devastated that this group of people would no longer be in my life. And I think that is a very important point that he's closing on. When we get attached to characters, it's not just because we're projecting ourselves into them. There has to be something on the author's part that prepares us to have a robust connection with the characters. Now, here's another review by Matt Hillard in there. Yet There Are Statues. He writes, I started reading Belgariad with some trepidation. Eddings was the last hurdle for looking at fantasy because on the one hand his books are quite popular, but on the other hand because he doesn't have a very good reputation among the net literati. The verdict is in. Eddings is no Tolkien imitator, which is sometimes a charge brought up there. Like Tolkien, he bases the structure of his work on the epics of the past. However, unlike Tolkien, he has very different goals. In the introduction to my edition, Edding states the map of the world came before anything else. The tempting contrast is Tolkien creating the first of the Elvish languages. Although this is not the place to describe Tolkien's motivations, suffice it to say he was motivated primarily to develop a history and stories in that history that served as elaborations on themes and values that were central to his thinking. The world he created predated even the early work on his epic Lord of the Rings by decades. Eddings, on the other hand, seems to have started with the epic structure and his geography and worked his way from there. The result is an epic that is thorough in a very odd areas and curious, uninformed in those I personally consider more important. Did I mention it's pretty good? If I do an entire review as comparison to Tolkien, it'll sound awful, but Eddings has two things going for him. First, he rigidly adheres to some of the most successful storytelling patterns in history. You may not be surprised by much, but surprise is overrated in fiction. Second, and perhaps more importantly, as a writer, Eddings is very good with light moments and banter between his many named characters. He uses all the right tricks to make sure you will remember the important aspects of a character and is content to sit back and let them chew the scenery. For the rest, Eddings is capable enough. The fact Edding started with a map weighs heavily on the finished product. It is what, in my personal lingo, I call a grand tour. Every separate spot on the map is visited. Once I realized how the characters were carefully zigzagging through the map, it took a little away from the story. So this is a negative point. More problematic was the ruthless stereotyping. Edding says in the introduction to my edition he wanted to write a more realistic epic. It didn't seem all that gritty to me. I can only guess he mentions supply trains when the big army has been assembled. What I cannot understand is why he would then make such a mockery of his nationalities, leaving aside his frequent misuse of the word race. The only reason the army has supply trains is it has brought along a king with the practical stereotype. Lucky for them, it was Sendarians, not Tolnedrians, who are practical. I suppose I lied. I do understand why he does it. It's a crutch that allows him to use a much larger cast than is really necessary. Since all the characters adhere so rigorously to their types, you simply have to remember the reigning type for each nationality, and there's no need to flip to a dramatis personae. Now, I'm going to pause on that for a moment. This does get brought up by multiple reviewers. I think that you can say that there is definitely stereotyping going on, and there are these different, nationalities, races, whatever you want to call them, of human beings. There's clearly mixing going on as well. And I think it's partly right, partly wrong. I would say that there's room for characters that are important to move around within that, right? And sometimes it's even necessary. I think about Brand, and the Rivens and the sort of like rigidity that they have, and his rejecting his own son's confession and plea for forgiveness as his son is dying. Yes, that's coming out of a stereotype. Eddings could have easily allowed him to say, I will, forgive you, let's have a reconciliation before you die. And we might praise him for that, but in a way, sticking with the stereotype of the warden of the West, it might actually produce a greater effect. All right, going on. Here's another thing I really disagree with. One of the major elements of the story is the concept of fate and prophecy, but unfortunately, Edding seems to have included it because he felt it was expected without actually thinking about too hard. Unfortunately, fate is really more of a Greek issue, while the rest of Edding's story comes from Christian, specifically romantic sources. If you ask me, the tiny role prophecy and fate played in Lord of the Rings was somewhat of a mistake, but at least it was part of a larger theme relating to his monotheism and the toleration of evil. The only justification for Edding's material here is a bunch of hand-waving about the universe. He seems to have come up with the two prophecy concept as an attempt to give his main character free will, but giving him about 5 minutes of free will, during which, I might add, he makes no choices other than a hand-waving psychological gambit. I think that's wrong. I think that's completely backwards. I don't think Eddings has two prophecies because that allows him to have moments of free will. The characters all do have free will involved, but it's part of a fabric. And it's not as if Christian thought doesn't have a notion of providence, similar to some pagan thought where there is a grand plan and you can fight against it, but you'll somehow get incorporated back into it. And I do think that Edding's two prophecy thing is actually quite innovative. So I think that this reviewer probably just didn't get it in this case. He also goes on to say the other problem with his metaphysics is the empty religion he's provided, again, without seeming to give it much thought. His gods are bound by fate, not the enforcers of it, and seem to have been given the fallibility of man. It all begs the question, what are they doing in the story? Not much, of course. Well, I don't think that's correct either. They play pretty important roles, and they are, I would say, developed interestingly as well. So we'll pass on from that. Here we get to a somewhat more critical, in the negative sense, review by Daniel Polanski, First Loves and Bad Fantasy, rereading David Eddings. So it starts. Before George R.R. Martin, before Robert Jordan, though long after Tolkien, there was David Eddings. At the peak of his fame, his books were predictable bestsellers, moving millions of copies across dozens of different languages, most famous for a pair of interlinked quintologies entitled The Belgariad and the Malloreon, respectively. Eddings' work tells the story of an everyman boy who discovers he is in fact the most powerful and important person in all of existence, heir to a throne, a giant sword, and enormous magical powers. This is fantasy in every sense of the word, a vast, if uncomplicated tableau of gods, nations, and heroes, all of whom exist for the single purpose of affirming our hero's unique importance and of furthering his crucial mission. Once recognized as a grandmaster of the genre, Eddings and his fellows 90s mainstay, Piers Anthony, Terry Brooks, and the like, have in more recent years largely fallen down the memory hole, forgotten entirely, or seen as somewhat shameful touchstones for modern readers and authors. Nonetheless, their influence, particularly in the young adult space, seems indisputable. And then he goes on and he says something that I would interpret in a somewhat different way. Like most successful works of this genre, Eddings' work has its vice or virtue in extraordinary simplicity, one that could probably only exist in the early state of a genre's development before the audience becomes educated to the tropes and cliches inherent within. I'm not so sure about that. And I do think that keeping things, let's say, instead of simple, because it's not a simple work, but straightforward, sticking to the storytelling techniques or patterns, or if you want to call them tropes, certainly does. That is something Eddings is doing, but the question is he doing it effectively, right? So the vice or virtue, the badness or goodness depends on that, right? Going on from here, he's going to say the general lack of sophistication extends to the cast of characters, which is large, colorful, and thinly drawn in classic fashion. Each tends to have a single attribute. One is sneaky, one overpious, along with a distinct weapon or special power, and any interaction with said character is sure to mention these peculiarities, often utilizing language more or less identical to previous descriptions. I would say that's actually wrong. I could think of some characters in the work that do fit that, but I can think of others where there's some actual development across the books, and they were originally identified as being this sort, and then they turn out differently. Great example of this is Relg, right? The Algo, who is the, fanatic priest of all, very obsessed with bodily purity, in part because he feels himself oppressed by his desires for women, so sexuality is a problem with him. He winds up becoming involved with this woman who is from a race that has been either destroyed or sold into slavery, and they have a very complex and developing interaction that other characters actually reflect upon and talk about. So I think this is actually quite wrong. He goes on and says, the world building is similarly schematic, with polities and people described with all the complexity of a Milton Berle routine. Like individual characters, nations are formed around distinct and simple traits. The peoples of the West include in their ranks nations of drunken Vikings, thoughtlessly noble knights who stand in opposition to a similar conglomeration of unabashedly evil peoples, brutish servants of a dark god. And he says, the linguistic and narrative superficiality is matched by a thematic moralizing of similar depth. Violence solves every problem. The final conflict which decides the fate of the universe is a literal sword fight, and our heroes are the best at violence, the apotheosis of Voltaire's dictum that God is on the side of the big battalions. The villains are undeniably pointlessly evil, primarily concerned with human sacrifice and the conquering of other nations, by which they can gain more humans to sacrifice. So the Grolem, that describes them. Does that describe the other four groups in the East, the Angaraks? Does that describe the Murgos? No. Definitely doesn't describe the Thals, whose main concern is not getting sacrificed by Grolem. It doesn't describe the merchant class or the Malorians. They're more complex than that. Now, granted, there is a lot of stereotyping going on, but there are characters who seem to exceed or surpass or break out of that, and there's some fairly complex motives there. Now, here's where it gets interesting. So this person is reconsidering their own, reading, and he says, we can accept that love for another person is often complex and multifaceted, but to love a story seems simpler, superficially less dangerous. Locked in time, unable to reciprocate our affection, existing simply to please us, we cannot imagine a book might become a source of difficulty or impediment. Perhaps it would be wiser to look on lost literary loves with the same weariness one develops for unhealthy romantic attachments, but fandom, generally speaking, does not seem to work this way. Long after the names and faces of our childhood crush has faded into obscurity, we remain loyal to the fictional friends of our youth. At its worst, this unreflective arrogance represents fandom at its ugliest and most stupid, right? And then he says, to maintain loyalty to old aesthetic allegiances can be a manifestation of kindness to our younger selves, a form of self-focused compassion. Even works of the most dubious merit have as their grace the fact that we remember them and have attached to that memory a collection of others, where we were when we read it, what we were listening to, what we were doing, who we were. What new book come along so late in the day could possibly compete with that rose tint of nostalgia? Okay, I think that's an interesting set of reflections there. Now, that's only helpful for those who read the series when they were young and are now coming to it and are trying to figure out, well, why do I still like this even though I don't like it? Not new readers like myself. I never read this as a young person. But I could see the broader point. We could say this about other things, movies, artworks, music. There's a short thing by Kitten Kong 42 called The Belgariad, Not All Tropes Are Bad. And I think this is quite right. The novels are a classic hero's journey featuring the young farm boy who turns out to be the long-lost heir to a throne and savior of the world. He's inevitably an orphan with magical abilities, a wise old mentor, assorted companions, and he marries the beautiful princess he bickers with. Yes, to an extent, it's a total cliche. But that's almost the point. Eddings took high fantasy and hero's journey tropes and made them into a series where personality was more important than place. The countries in the books are straight out of the Planet of Hats, the people in them being defined by national characteristics. So the Arends are medieval England with a Saxon-Norman split, the Cherokes are Vikings, Tolnedrons are Romans, the bad guys are from the East, and the plot is relatively linear. But it just works, and that's because Eddings can write really engaging characters. The wise mentor, who's thousands of years old and revered as a kind of god, is actually still an occasional drunk, sometimes thief, and general vagrant. His real skill, Eddings' real skill as an author, is writing snappy dialogue and speeding the plot along. So that's a very interesting take, isn't it? It's saying, yes, this is going to be stereotypical, it's using tropes or patterns, whatever you want to call them, but it's doing so well. So that's not the line of attack that you actually want to have unless you're turned off by the chosen one arrangement. But we could still ask, is this just a chosen one, story? Or does, as I mentioned before, the double prophecy really contribute something interesting to that? Or are the characters well developed or not? So I think that's an important thing to bring up. We're going to finish this little part by looking at something that some things that Eddings himself said, and this is in a conversation with Stan Nichols. It was in Starlog magazine. It's been, reprinted in many other places on the web. So it begins by talking about Eddings and Tolkien, right? And Eddings calling him Papa, but having some reservations of the legacy of the Lord of the Rings. So here's what Eddings says. There's no doubt the man's a giant. The thing is that Papa was such a giant in the 60s, he seems to have established the parameters of what fantasy is. Even to the point, my former editor, Lester Del Rey, could say, fantasy is the most prissy of all art forms. He meant that what people will accept in, say, bodice rippers, they find absolutely unacceptable in fantasy. In other words, part of Tolkien's heritage is a certain prudishness. With one or two possible exceptions, there aren't any female hobbits, and his heroines end at the neck. You have the beautiful hair and eyes, but that's about it. This was like waving a red flag in my face, and I went out of my way to start pushing it at the edges. Not to turn my fantasy into pornography or anything of this nature, but just to see if I could get away with taking it a little bit further in that regard. I'm having a great deal of fun pushing against those boundaries of prissiness and inserting an erotic element into my work. Now, I would like to say here, if you want to compare Eddings to more contemporary fantasy authors, you can see that he's not prudish, but he's certainly not revealing an awful lot by, comparison to George R. R. Martin or to even going further than that, R. Scott Bakker, who people have kind of joked around about. He loves to write, phalluses into his stories and all that. But we could also think about comparing him to somebody who's much more contemporary, Tanith Lee. There's an awful lot more sexiness, we could say, in Tanith Lee's stuff than there is in Eddings, but it's there, particularly in the very end of the 5th volume where Kenedra is like hinting to Garion that, hey, it's about time to go to bed and you're going to be awake for a lot longer, my husband, So it's clear there's stuff going on. And so he goes on and he says, this ties in with recognizing the fact and disliking the fact that people in America are absolutely convinced the melody for Greensleeves is a Christmas hymn. It was composed in praise of a prostitute, of course. Come on, I've read Chaucer. I know there were prostitutes in the Middle Ages. And if I'm dealing realistically with the Middle Ages, I'm going to have pickpockets, I'm going to have thieves, and I'm going to have prostitutes. I think the third character who appears in the Elenium is a prostitute, a little streetwalker. Now that's a different series, right? And he goes on, his fantasy world has its basis in the Middle Ages, but the culture, politics, and magical system was devised by scratch. And he's asked, isn't this one of the more difficult aspects of being an author in the genre? And Eddings says, it can be very difficult, yes, and you have to be conversant with many, many things. You can have a character say, gee, they bounced one of my checks in a contemporary story, and everyone will know what they're talking about. Well, they would at the time that he said this, wouldn't they? But younger readers, do you know what a bounced check is? Maybe not, right? You have to invent the theology, sociology, and everything else. And when you begin, as I did, by dropping 3 or 4 eons of Western European culture into a blender, when you throw in peoples who are essentially ancient Romans, French and Spanish noblemen, Vikings, and Muslims, when you put that all together and press the on button, you get a very strange mix of anachronisms. It gets you thinking about what sort of world it would be with Romans and Arabs living next to each other, for instance, which did happen at a certain point, in Byzantium and the, rising Arab kingdoms, right? So he goes on, the temptation to also invent some kind of magical MacGuffin to get his hero out of a tight corner is something else that his works try to avoid. And he explains, it's the Superman complex, isn't it? If you're more powerful than a locomotive and can leap tall buildings at a single bound, what do you have to worry about? Take the all-powerful sorcerer. There's nothing he has to fear. The guy is bulletproof. I spoke with Lester Del Rey about this rather extensively. He said, the only way you can get around it is to come up with believable limitations, and you have to be very specific about what those limitations are right at the outset. My gimmick is that magic is tiring. Wizardry poops you out. So doing something with magic is as hard as doing it with your back. It's just that it happens almost instantaneously. And he says, I refine the gimmick so that when a character does something with magic, it makes a noise that other sorcerers can hear. If you're trying to tiptoe through the tulips and sneak your way through the back alleys using magic, you're going to sound off burglar alarms all over town. Everybody who's the least bit talented at this sort of thing is going to hear what you're doing, which is a significant factor if stealth is important, which it is in the series, right? On the subject of magic, incidentally, the fact that she's a little too specific about her spells is perhaps my one and only argument with Catherine Kurtz. It might also be a criticism that could be levied against Jack Vance or others as well. So he goes on and says, if you got some start telling readers how to do a spell, whether or not it works, and they're going to try it. If you've got some 14-year-old kid with terminal acne who's absolutely convinced that if he recites this particular spell, he'll be able to fly and goes and jumps off a 70-story building, that's your fault. I feel a sense of responsibility, so I'm pretty vague when I get to sorcery. I use the gimmick of the will is the word, which means that when a character wants to use magic, they simply say, happen, let it be so, or whatever. The more susceptible reader can go ahead and concentrate as hard as they want, and I don't think, like Uri Geller, they can bend a key with only their mind. If they can, they probably have a future in showbiz. So some interesting remarks in that interview. I've only given you excerpts from it, from Eddings himself. And we get quite a diverse mix of assessments of what is going on in these 5 novels tied together in a single big story, The Belgariad. It is indeed a chosen one story, but is it just a chosen one story? And how well does it do that trope? How well is it developed? That's the sort of question that I think we have to ask. And this is something that, like many matters that we call matters of taste or aesthetics, each of us has to answer. We can make arguments to each other. We can give the criteria that we think matter, but ultimately each of us has to decide. I will tell you that I have greatly enjoyed the writing and the thinking about it, and that it had enough philosophical ballast to keep me attuned to it. So I don't think that the 2 prophecies thing or the gods or, all of that is weak. I actually think that's a strong point of these novels and this grand narrative. So that's where we'll end this part. And now we can start talking about some of the really interesting philosophical themes involved in this. For me, as a reader who is paying attention both to, we could call it the literary aspects of the work, and to philosophical, particularly metaphysical and ethical aspects of the work, one of the most interesting philosophical themes that is being handled in it is the dual prophecy. And this arose already and got talked about quite a lot, explored quite a bit in the first 3 books of the Belgariad, but we're going to get to see the contours of it elaborated more fully and the prophecy brought to its close in the final two books. Now, when we talk about a double or dual prophecy, this is one of the, I would say, innovations of Edding's work here in the Belgariad. So let's remind ourselves of a few things that were revealed in the course of the first three books. Number one, there isn't just a prophecy about a chosen one who's going to fight a dark lord, which is, kind of a stock fantasy theme, right? And Eddings knows that it's a stock theme. He's deliberately doing things this way. One of the ways in which this is different is that from the beginning of time, there have been two prophecies, two different ways in which things are being, you could say, arranged and connected to each other, and they both exist. They are both real, and they will continue to be so, eventually converging onto a crisis point that is happening at the very end of the fifth novel, just before the epilogue. It's an epilogue to the fulfillment. So it's not a fulfillment of a prophecy. It is two different, massive, metaphysical, not even entities, but arrangements of the universe that are converging upon each other. And one of them will dominate and the other one will go away. And Belgarian, the central character of the Belgariad, the chosen one, he is going to be one of the central people in both prophecies. Because in one prophecy, he loses the ultimate battle and things go awry. In another, he wins. But it's not just him. It's also Torok, the god, a veritable god who rules over one of the largest groups of people in the world, the Angarax, who is going to be involved in the prophecy. Polgaroth is also involved. Will she be his bride? Will she not be? So things are really quite complex. And as we know, there's a dry voice in Garian's head that he hears telling him things, sometimes giving us info dumps. And that voice is the one side of the prophecy. Although we're going to see a little bit later, it's going to say prophecy isn't quite the right term. So this is a complex idea that is absolutely central to the plot of this 5-novel sequence. So what do we learn about this? There's a number of passages that I've picked out, beginning in Castle of Wizardry. So this is a discussion that's going on after it looks like the Silk and Polgara are trying to figure out what to do along with Garian with the Eternal Man, the great wizard, who may have lost his powers. And we hear, here we go. An episode like this can have very serious effects, and there's no way to know how he'll be when he recovers. He could be very seriously weakened. This is about Belgarath. Weakened how? His will could be greatly reduced to that of any other man. He drained it to the outer limit, and he might have gone so far he'll never regain his powers. You mean he wouldn't be a sorcerer anymore? Don't repeat the obvious, Garian, she said wearily. If that happens, it's going to be up to you and me to conceal it from everybody. Your grandfather's power is the one thing that has held the Angarax in check for all these years. If something happened to it, you and I will have to make it look as if he's the same he always was. We'll have to conceal the truth from him if it's possible. What can we do without him? We'd go on, Garian, she replied. Our task is too important for us to falter because a man falls by the wayside. Even if this man happens to be your grandfather, we're racing against time in all this. We absolutely must fulfill the prophecy and get the orb back to Riva by Aristide, and there are people who are to be gathered up to go with us. Who? Princess Kenedra, for one. Kenedra? Garion had never really forgotten the little princess, but he failed to see why Aunt Pole was making such an issue of her going with them to Riva. In time, you'll understand, dear. All of this is part of a series of events that must occur in proper sequence and at the proper time. Here we get a little bit more metaphysical. In most situations, the present is determined by the past. This series of events is different, however. In this case, what's happening in the present is determined by the future. If we don't get it exactly the way it's supposed to be, the ending will be different, and I don't think any of us would like that at all. So, very interesting reflection there. Time, temporality, when it comes to the prophecy, is not just this linear thing that we often take it to be, where a prophecy is made in the past and then it predetermines what's going to happen. No, there's something different going on. Let's look at the next passage. So this is when the dry voice and Belgariad are talking with each other. So the dry voice says, "In many ways you're like Belgarath, his grandfather. Remarkably so, this irritability seems to be hereditary. It's only natural, I suppose," Garion conceded. "You said there was an alternative. An alternative to what? To this war that's giving you nightmares. Get dressed, I want to show you something." So Garion gets dressed. He says, "Where are we going?" And he says, "It isn't far." The room to which the other awareness directed him was musty and showed little evidence of use. The books and scrolls lining the shelves along its walls were dust-covered, and cobwebs draped the corners. Garion's lone candle cast looming shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. "On the top shelf," the voice told him, "the scroll wrapped in yellow linen. Take it down." "What is this?" Garion asks. "The Marin Codex. Take off the cover and start unrolling it. I'll tell you when to stop." Now, what is the Marin Codex? If you've read the first 3 books, you know that it is one of the articulations of the prophecy, unfortunately written by somebody who at the time writing it was insane. And it's, as these things tend to be, rather vague in parts. You're not sure exactly what they're referring to, but it's taken as being a revelation of what is to come. At least one way things can go. So, the voice says, "That's the passage. Read it." Garion struggled over the words. "It doesn't make any sense." "The man who wrote it down was insane," the voice apologized, "and he was an imbecile besides, but he was all I had to work with. Try it again out loud." Now, let's pause on that for a moment. So the Marin Codex is written down by somebody that the same entity that Garion has carried with him his entire life, whose voice he hears in his head, sometimes speaks through Garion, or even uses his body, used this other person in the past to write the prophecy. Garion says, "It still doesn't make any sense." And what does he say? "Behold, it shall come to pass that in a certain moment that which must be and that which must not be shall meet, and in that meeting shall be decided all that has gone before and all that will come after. Then will the child of light and the child of dark face each other in the broken tomb, and the stars will shudder and grow dim." So we've got a lot of components there. That which must be, one prophecy, and that which must not be shall meet. Now, which is which? Well, that's where it gets complicated. You don't know which is going to be the one that must be and the one that must not be, right? That's part of what's going to be decided in the clash of the two timelines, prophecies, arrangements of the universe coming together. In that meeting shall be decided not just all that will come after, all that has gone before. In a certain way, it will remake the past, depending on which side wins, which prophecy dominates. Then we get something that's a little bit more clear. The child of light, the child of dark are going to face each other. And Garion asks, well, who's this child of light? And the voice says, well, you are. For the moment, at least, it changes. Me? Of course. Then who's this child of dark I'm supposed to meet? Torak. Torak? I should have thought that would be obvious by now. I told you once about the two possible destinies coming together finally. You and Torak, the child of light and the child of dark, embody those destinies. But Torak's asleep. Not anymore. When you first put your hand on the orb, the touch signaled his awakening. Even now he stirs on the edge of awareness, and his hand fumbles for the hilt of Ctheric Guru, his black sword. Garion went very cold. Are you trying to say I'm supposed to fight Torak alone? It's going to happen, Belgariad. The universe itself rushes towards it. You can gather an army if you want, but your army or Torak's won't mean anything. As the Codex says, everything will be decided when you finally meet him. In the end, you'll face each other alone. That's what I meant by an alternative. What you're saying is that I'm supposed to go off alone and find him and fight him? Garion demanded incredulously. Approximately, yes. I won't do it. That's up to you. Garion struggled with it. If I take an army, I'll just get a lot of people killed and it won't make a difference in the end anyway. Not the least bit. In the end, it will just be you, Torak, Ctheric Guru, and the Sword of the Riven King. Don't I have any choice at all? None whatsoever. Do I have to go alone? Garion asked plaintively. It doesn't say that. Could I take one or two people with me? That's your decision, Belgariad. Just don't forget to take your sword. So, some very interesting stuff there, particularly if we're thinking about this in terms of free will. Garion can't evade his destiny, which is to face off against Torak. What he does have a choice about, where there is free will involved, is how he's going to do it. Is he going to raise an army and take that and get a whole bunch of people killed? He could do that. It's certainly within the scope of his decision-making. He could also go completely alone. Or he could take a few trusted companions, which is indeed what he's going to do, taking Belgariad and Silk with him, right? So he's talking just briefly after that with Belgariad and Silk and says, I've just found out what it is that I'm supposed to do, grandfather. Who told you? He did. And Belgariad says, a bit premature perhaps. I was going to wait a little longer, but I have to assume he knows what he's doing. And so Belgariad is quite aware of this, and he's talking with Silk, and he says, you're aware of the prophecy. Naturally, it appears that the prophecy is a bit more than a statement about the future. It seems to take a hand in things from time to time. It speaks to Garion on occasion. So the prophecy itself is not just a declaration or we might say, set of propositions or even a mechanics of causes. It has consciousness. It makes choices of its own as well. So Belgariad says, what did he tell you? He showed me the Marin Codex. And he says, well, what part did he show you? The part about the meeting of the child of light and the child of dark. And Belgariad says, oh, I was afraid it might be that part. Did he explain it? Well, now you know at the worst. What are you going to do about it? He gave me a couple alternatives, Garion said. I can wait until we get an army together and we can go off and fight back and forth with the Angarax for generations. That's one way, isn't it? Belgariad nodded. Of course, that will get millions of people killed for nothing, won't it? The old man nodded again. Or I can go off by myself and find Torak wherever he is and try to kill him. He didn't say I had to go alone. I asked him about that. Thanks, Belgariad said. And so that's when they decide that they are going to go off and sneak out and pursue that destiny, which is what occupies a good portion of the 2 books to come. Later on, also in Castle of Wizardry, another discussion that's going on. This is quite interesting. Garion is meeting with Poledra, and this is his grandmother in many respects. So he says, "How is it that you're here? Aren't you well? Dead, do you mean? Don't be afraid of the word. It's only a word after all. I suppose I am, though. It doesn't really feel all that different." "Doesn't somebody have to do something to bring you back?" he asked, "like what Aunt Pol did that time when we were fighting with Grol in the mountains of Ulgo?" "It's not entirely necessary. I can be summoned that way, but I can manage it myself if I have to." And then she says, "You're really confused by all this, aren't you?" "All of what?" "Everything. Who you are, who we are, what you have to do." "A little," he admitted, and now we're going to get a good explanation. "Let me see if I can explain it. Take him, for instance. I never really saw him as a man, you know, Belgarath. There's something decidedly wolfish about him. I always rather thought his being born in man shape had been a mistake of some kind. Maybe it was because of what he had to do. The shape doesn't really matter, though." "It doesn't? Did you really think it did?" She almost seemed to laugh. "Here, let me show you. Let's change." She shimmered into air and was standing before him then in the form of a tawny-haired woman with golden eyes. Her gown was very plain and brown. Garion shrugged himself back into his natural form. "Am I really any different, Belgarian?" she asked him. "Am I not who I am, whether as wolf or owl or woman?" And then he understood. "May I call you grandmother?" he asked her, a bit embarrassed. "If it makes you happy," she replied. "It's a bit inaccurate, though." "I know," he said, "but I feel a little more comfortable with it." Now we get to the point. "Have you finally accepted who you are?" "I don't have much choice, do I?" "But you're afraid of it and what you have to do. Is that it?" He nodded mutely. "You're not going to be alone, you know." He looked at her sharply. "I thought the Codex said," and here we get the important revelation. "The Codex doesn't really say everything that's involved. Your meeting with Torak will be the coming together of 2 enormous opposing forces. The 2 of you are really just the representatives of those forces. There'll be so much power involved in your meeting that you and Torak will be almost incidental to what's really happening." And then he raises a really important question. "Well, why couldn't it be someone else then?" he asked quickly, "someone better suited to it." "I said almost incidental. It has to be you, and it's always been Torak. You are the channels through which the forces will collide. When it happens, I think you'll be surprised at how easy it is." "Am I going to win?" "I don't know. The universe itself doesn't know. That's why you have to meet him. If we knew how it would turn out, the meeting wouldn't be necessary." As she looked around, "Belgarath's coming back. I have to leave you now." So, isn't that interesting? The universe itself doesn't know which of the prophecies, which of the forces is going to triumph. It has to actually happen. Later on, also in Castle of Wizardry, Lady Polgara and Kenedra are together and talking about what's going to be going on. This is after Garion and Belgarath and Silk have really ticked them all off, taking off in the middle of the night, leaving them to figure out what they're going to do. Polgara is really angry, right? So anyway, Kenedra is asking, "You knew, didn't you? You knew all along." A faint flicker of amusement touched Polgara's lips. "You always seem to forget that I have certain advantages, dear, and one of those is that I have a general idea of how things are going to turn out." "How could you possibly? Certain events don't just happen, Kenedra. Some things have been implicit in this world since the moment it was made. What happened today was one of those things. Would you like to hear what the prophecy says about you?" Kenedra felt a sudden chill. Polgara ran her eyes down the crackling parchment. "Here it is," she said, lifting the scroll into the candlelight. "And the voice of the bride of light shall be heard in the kingdoms of the world, and her word shall be as a fire in dry grass. That multitude shall rise up to go forth under the blaze of her banner." That doesn't mean anything at all, Lady Polgara, Kinedra objected. It's absolute gibberish. Does it become any clearer when you find out that Garion is the child of light? What is that? Kinedra demanded, staring at the parchment. Where did you get it? It's the Marin Codex, dear. My father copied it for me from the original. It's a bit obscure because the Marin prophet was so hopelessly insane he couldn't speak coherently. King Dross Bullneck finally had to keep him chained to a post like a dog. King Dross? Lady Polgara, that was over 3,000 years ago. About that long. Yes, Polgara agreed. Kinedra began to tremble. That's impossible, she blurted. Polgara said, sometimes, Kinedra, you sound exactly like Garion. I wonder why young people are so fond of that word. But, Lady Polgara, if it hadn't been for the young man who was so insulting, I might not have said anything at all. The princess bit her lip. She had not meant to confess that. That's probably why he was so insulting then. It's quite possible that insulting you at that particular moment was the only reason he was born in the first place. The prophecy leaves nothing to chance. Do you think you might need him to get you started next time? I can arrange to have him get drunk if you do. And so we're going to talk more about that as well. And she goes on and she says, your voice will be heard in the land, and your voices shall be as a fire in dry grass, and the multitudes of the west shall rise up to follow your banner down through all the centuries. I've never known the Marin Codex to be wrong, not once. The main thing at the moment is for you to get plenty of rest and eat regularly. It would help if you were a bit more robust, but I guess we'll have to do with what we have. So again, you can't evade your part in the prophecy. What you can do is get some rest and make yourself ready to do your part. Then later on, now this is an Enchanter's Endgame, we're going to get an interesting, let's call it reinterpretation of the prophecy. So this is Garion and Belden and Belgarath talking about what's going on. And we find out that these twin wizards they went into a trance and they were repeating the gibberish from the Marin Codex. And the place where the Marin prophet's mind broke down and he degenerated into animal noises for a while. Anyway, they went back over that part, only this time it came out coherently. So we're getting additional revelation, you could say. What did they say? Are you sure you want to know? Of course I want to know. All right, it went like this. Behold, the heart of the stone shall relent, and the beauty that was destroyed shall be restored, and the eye that is not shall be made whole again. Belgarath stared at him. That's it? That's it, Belden said. But what does it mean, Garion asked. Just what it says, Belgarian, Belden replied. For some reason, the orb is going to restore Torak. Garion began to tremble as the full impact of Belden's words struck him. Torak's going to win then, he said numbly. It didn't say anything about winning or losing, Belgarian, Belden corrected him. All it said was that the orb is going to undo what it did to Torak when he used it to crack the world. It doesn't say anything about why. That's always been the trouble with the prophecy, Belgarath observed. It can mean any one of a dozen things, or all of them, Belden added. That's what makes it so difficult to understand sometimes. We tend to concentrate on one thing, but the prophecy includes everything at the same time. I'll work on it and see if I can wring some sense out of it. If I come up with anything, I'll let you know. I'd better be getting back, right? So this sounds rather bad. And Garion is riding, slumped in despair. They were going to lose and Torak was going to kill him. And we have this dialogue. Stop feeling so sorry for yourself, the inner voice told him finally. Why did you get me into this? Garion demanded bitterly. We've discussed that before. He's going to kill me. What gives you that idea? That's what the prophecy said, Garion stopped abruptly as a thought occurred to him. And now this is kind of an important moment. You said it yourself. You're the prophecy, aren't you? It's a misleading term, and I didn't say anything about winning or losing. Isn't that what it means? No, it means exactly what it says. What else could it mean? You're getting more stubborn every day. Stop worrying so much about meanings and just do what you have to do. You almost had it right back there. If you're just going to talk in riddles, why bother with it at all? Why go to all the trouble of saying things nobody's able to understand? Because it's necessary to say it. The word determines the event. The word puts limits on the event and shapes it. Without the word, the event is merely a random happening. Now notice this. That's the whole purpose of what you call prophecy, to separate the significant from the random. I don't understand. I didn't think you would, but you asked after all. Now stop worrying about it. It has nothing to do with you. So the prophecy is revealing something about the prophecy, namely that the purpose of prophecy is not just to foretell the future and line everybody up. It's got a function of articulation, of separation. This is deep metaphysics here going on within this work. And Garian, of course, doesn't understand because it's tricky to wrap our heads around. Does the reader fully understand? It depends on the kind of reader that we've got. All right, so going on, we're getting closer to the realization of the two prophecies, right? We're going to read that. Here's a discussion. Kenedra is part of it again. And Belden is involved as well. And she asks, are you afraid too? And he says, my fears are a bit more exotic, such as, we've been at this for a very long time. Belgariad, Pol, the twins, and I'm more concerned about something going wrong than I am about my own personal safety. Kenedra then asks, well, how do you mean wrong? Here's what Belden says. The prophecy is very complex, and it doesn't say everything. The two possible outcomes of this are still absolutely balanced as far as I can tell. Something very, very slight could tip that balance one way or the other. It could be something that I've overlooked. That's what I'm afraid of. All we can do is the best we can. That might not be enough. What else can we do? I don't know, and that's what worries me. Why worry about something if you can't do anything about it? Now you're starting to sound like Belgariad. He tends to shrug things off and trust to his luck sometimes. I like things a little neater, right? So this is about how to interpret the not completely clear prophecy, right? Underdetermined, we might say. Now we're getting almost to the very end as things are wrapping up. And this is when Pol and Kenedra have been taken prisoner and are actually being brought to the Dark City. And Urtag is meeting Polgara. By the way, Polgara, according to the prophecy, at least one version of it, is supposed to become the bride of Torok, and she does not want that at all. Torok is a horrible being, and we're going to find out about that in a little bit more detail a little bit later on. So here we go. Urtak, the high priest, the archpriest, says, do not rail against your foreordained fate, Queen of Angarak. And she says, I have two fates awaiting me, Urtak. Which one I will follow has not yet been decided. I do not have any doubts about that matter, he declared. That's probably because you've never dared to look at the alternatives, she replied. Shall we go, Urtak? A windy beach is hardly the place for philosophical discussion. So there are people who think there's only one fate, one prophecy, and then there are those who realize things are balanced between the two of them. Dernick says, the smith, who's, by the way, going to play a massively important role in how the prophecy works out as far as Polgara goes, he says, Mistress Pol, shouldn't we be working on some kind of plan? For what, Dernick? For our escape, of course. But we don't want to escape, Dernick. We don't. The Growlums are taking us to the place we want to go. Why do we want to go to this Clo Mishrak of theirs? We have something to do there. From everything I've heard, it's a bad sort of place. Are you sure you haven't made some mistake? She reached out and laid her hand on his arm. Dear Dernick, you'll just have to trust me. Of course, Mistress Pole. But shouldn't I know what to expect? If I should have to take steps to protect you, I ought to be prepared. I'd tell you if I knew, Dernick, she said, but I don't know what we should expect. All I know is that the four of us are supposed to go to Cthul Mishrak. What's going to happen there needs us in order for it to be complete. Each of us has something to do there. Even me? Especially you, Dernick. At first I didn't understand who you really are. That's why I tried to keep you from coming along. But now I do understand. You have to be there because you're going to do the one thing that's going to turn the entire outcome one way or the other. Isn't that interesting to find out? It's not just Garion or Torak, these two, primal representatives. It's not just Polgara, although she's going to be massively important. Dernick is going to do the one thing that's going to turn the entire outcome one way or the other. So he asked, well, what is it? She said, well, we don't know. His eyes grew wide. What if I do it wrong? He asked in a worried voice. I don't think you can, she assured him. From everything I understand, what you're going to do will flow very naturally out of who and what you are. You won't be able to do it wrong, Dernick, any more than you'd be able to lie or cheat or steal. It's built into you to do it right, so don't worry about it, right? And he is going to sacrifice himself to try to save Polgara, and that is going to steel her resistance to the massive, almost irresistible will of Torak trying to compel her to become his bride, which will then change things and affect things. So, we have one other interesting thing from another character, Zadar, who was one of the sorcerers, but who betrayed them. And here we go. You can't evade your responsibility with the pretense of necessity, the voice beyond the door continued. Aren't we all driven by necessity, Polgara? The stranger's voice replied with a kind of weary sadness. I won't say that I was blameless, but wasn't my apostasy predestined? The universe has been divided against itself since the beginning of time, and now the two prophecies rush towards each other for their final meeting when all will be resolved. Who can say that what I have done was not essential to that meeting? That's an evasion, Zadar, Aunt Pole told him. What's she doing here? Garion whispered to Belgarath. She's supposed to be here, Belgarath whispered back with an odd note of satisfaction. Listen, I don't think we'll gain anything by wrangling with each other, Polgara, Zadar the opposite was saying. We each believe that what we did was right. Neither of us could persuade the other to change sides at this point. Why don't we just let it go at that, right? And she's going to ask Zadar a little bit later, why did you betray our master? Her voice was strangely compassionate. To save the orb, he replied sadly. That was the idea at first. From the moment I saw it, it owned me. After Torak took it from our master, Belgarath and the others began making their plans to regain it by force, but I knew if Alder himself did not join his hand with theirs to strike directly at Torak, they'd fail and Alder would not do that. I reasoned that if force must fail, then guile might succeed. I thought by pretending allegiance to Torak, I might gain his confidence and steal it back from him. What happened, Zadar? There was another long, painful pause. Oh, Polgara, you cannot know. I was so sure of myself, so certain I could keep a part of my mind free from Torak's domination. But I was wrong. His mind and will overwhelmed me. He took me in his hand and he crushed out all my resistance. The touch of his hand, Polgara. There was a horror in Zadar's face. It reaches down to the very depths of your soul. I know Torak for what he is, loathsome, twisted, evil beyond your understanding of the word. But when he calls me, I must go, and what he bids me, I must do, even though my soul shrieks within me against it. Even now as he sleeps, his fist is around my heart. There was another hoarse sob. Didn't you know that it's impossible to resist a god? Aunt Pole asked in that same compassionate voice. Was it pride, Zedar? Were you so sure of your power that you thought you could trick him, that you could conceal your intention from him? Zedar sighed. Perhaps. Alder was a gentle master. He never brought his mind down on me, so I wasn't prepared for what Torak did to me. Torak is not gentle. What he wants, he takes. And if he must rip out your soul in the taking, it doesn't matter to him in the slightest. You'll discover his power, Polgara. Soon he'll awaken and he'll destroy Belgariad. Not even the Riven King is a match for that awful mind. And then Torak will take you for his bride, as he's always said he would. Don't resist him, Polgara. Save yourself that agony. In the end, you'll go to him anyway. You'll go willingly, even eagerly. So this is quite interesting, isn't it? Right? And I should mention, as the prophecy unfolds, since we already did bring up what's going to happen, Dernick is going to try to save Polgara, and instead he's going to be killed. So here we go. Aunt Pole was standing as if locked in place, her eyes wide as she stared in stunned belief at the still form of Dernick, the smith who lay crumpled on the floor, whose face had that deadly pale cast to it, could only mean one thing. A terrible flood of realization suddenly swept her face, a realization of an irrevocable loss. "No," she cried out. "My Dernick, no." She'd rushed to the fallen man, fell on her knees beside him, and gathered his still form into her arms with a heartbroken wail of grief and despair. And then Garion saw Zedar the apostate for the first time. The sorcerer was also staring at Dernick's body. There was a desperate regret on his face, a knowledge that he'd finally committed one act that put him beyond all hope of redemption. "You fool," he muttered. Why? Why did you make me kill you? That's the one thing above all others I did not want to do." So he and Belgarath are then going to have a wizard's battle, which is going to be resolved in Belgarath's favor. But this turns out to have been massively important, because as the sleeping god arises and tries to overpower Polgara, what is going to give her strength is Dernick and his death. So I'm going to read you a little bit of that. He says, "My bride." "Never, Torak," she declared. He ignored her defiance. "Thou hast come to me at last, Polgara," he gloated. "I have come to watch you die." "Die, Polgara? Me? No, my bride. That is not why thou hast come. My will is drawn thee to me as was foretold, and now thou art mine. Come to me, my beloved." "Never." "Never, Polgara? Thou wilt submit to me, my bride. I will bend thee to my will. Thy struggles will but make my victory over thee the sweeter. In the end, I will have thee. Come here." So overwhelming was the force of his mind. She swayed almost as a tree sways in the grip of a great wind. "No," she gasped. "Look at me, Polgara," he commanded, his voice almost purring. "I am thy fate. All that thou didst think to love before me shall fall away, and thou shalt love only me. Look at me." Helplessly, she turned her head and opened her eyes to stare at him. The hatred and defiance seemed to melt out of her, and a terrible fear came into her face. "Thy will crumbles, my beloved," he told her. "Now come to me." She must resist. All the confusion was gone now, and Garion understood at last. This was the real battle. If Aunt Pole succumbed, they were all lost. It had been for this. "Help her," the voice within him said. "Aunt Pole," Garion threw the thought at her. "Remember Dernick." He knew, without knowing how, he knew that this was the one thing that could sustain her in her deadly struggle. He ranged through her memory, throwing images of Dernick at her, of the smith's strong hands at work in his forge, of his serious eyes, of the quiet sound of his voice, and most of all of the good man's unspoken love for her, the love that had been the center of Dernick's entire life. She had begun involuntarily to move, no more than a slight shifting of her weight in preparation for that first fatal step in response to Torak's overpowering command. Once she had made that step, she would be lost, but Garian's memories of Durnik struck her like a blow. Her shoulders, which had already begun to droop in defeat, suddenly straightened. Her eyes flashed with renewed defiance. "Never," she told the expectantly waiting god. "I will not," will being italicized. Very important because everything is about the will here. A look of baffled frustration contorted Torak's face as he perceived that she would never yield, that her love would be forever denied to him. She had won, and her victory was like a knife twisting slowly within him. Thwarted, enraged, maddened by her now unalterable will to resist, Torak raised his face and suddenly howled. "Then perish both," he raged. "Die with thy father." And he raised his deadly sword. And then within Garian's mind, "Now, Belgarian!" And so the orb flares into life. The sword of the Riven King exploded into fire. Garian leaped forward, extending his sword to catch the deadly blow, which was already descending upon Aunt Pole's unprotected face. And now they fight. So we've had a really interesting reveal here. The prophecy was not just about the child of light and the child of darkness, fighting it with sword fighting. As you know, we've seen some critics say, "Oh, it's all resolved in the end by violence." It is not. It is resolved by will, but what lies beyond that will, what stiffens it? Love. Love is one part of the prophecy, and it enables Polgara to resist a god. Now it's Garian and Torak fighting. And how does Garian actually triumph? So Torak tries a number of different ways to sort of seduce Garian to his side. And he says, "Throw down thy sword, child of light, and bow before me." "I will not," Garian gasped. "You may kill me, but I will not yield." And then Torak says, "Thou must. Thou art helpless before me. Submit to me." "No," Garian shouted, and taking advantage of Torak's chagrin at that violent rejection, he rolled out from under the shadow of Cthairc Goru and sprang to his feet. Everything was clear now, and he knew at last how he could win. So here is where we're going to see the effective death blow before the sword death blow occur. "Hear me, maimed and despised God. You are nothing. Your people fear you, but they do not love you. You tried to deceive me into loving you. You tried to force Aunt Pole to love you, but I refused you, even as she did. You're a god, but you're nothing. In all the universe, there is not one person, not one thing that loves you. You are alone and empty, and even if you kill me, I'll still win. Unloved and despised, you'll howl out your miserable life to the end of days." Garian's words struck the maimed god like blows, and the orb, as if echoing these words, blazed anew, lashing at the dragon god with its consuming hatred. This was the event for which the universe had waited since the beginning of time. This was why Garian had come to this decaying room, not to fight Torak, but to reject him. With an animal howl of anguish and rage, the child of dark raised Cthairc Goru above his head and ran at the Riven King. Garian made no attempt to ward off the blow, but gripped the hilt of his flaming sword in both hands, and extending the blade before him, he lunged at his charging enemy. It was so easy, the sword of the Riven King slid into Torak's chest like a stick into water, and as it ran into the god's suddenly stiffening body, the power of the orb surged up the flaring blade. And this is how Torak will die, right? What killed him, though, was this rejection. So it turns out that the prophecy is really about love and hatred, or contempt, despising. It's not about swords. It's not about armies. It's not about this, primal, awaited battle in the end. It has to do with these fundamental emotions that so many philosophers have seen as being part of the cosmos itself, not just subjective things that we happen to feel. The last thing that I'm going to bring up, and this is happening in this section before we get to the epilogue. It was over, but there was a bitterness in the taste of Garian's victory. A man did not lightly kill a god, no matter how twisted or evil the god might be. And so Belgariad of Rivas stood sadly over the body of his fallen enemy as the wind, smelling faintly of the approaching dawn, washed over the decaying ruins of the city of night. Regrets, Garian? Belgarath asked quietly, putting his hand on his grandson's shoulder. Garian sighed. No, grandfather, he said. I suppose not really. It had to be done, didn't it? Belgarath nodded gravely. It's just that he was so alone at the end. I took everything away from him before I killed him. I'm not very proud of that. As you say, it had to be done. It was the only way you could beat him. I just wish I could have left him something, that's all. And they go through, then there's a sad little procession emerged, and Pol, Silk, and Kenedra were bringing out the body of Dernick the smith, and walking gravely beside them came Erend. A pang of almost unbearable grief ran through Garian. Dernick, his oldest friend, was pale and dead, and in that vast interval upheaval that had preceded the duel with Torek, Garian had not even been able to mourn. It was necessary, you understand, Belgarath said sadly. Why? Why did Dernick have to die, grandfather? Garian's voice was anguished, and tears stood out openly in his eyes. Because his death gave your aunt the will to resist Torek. That's always been the one flaw in the prophecy, the possibility that Pol might yield. All Torek needed was one person to love him. It would have made him invincible. What would have happened if she'd gone to him? You'd have lost the fight. That's why Dernick had to die. The old man sighed regretfully. I wish it could have been otherwise, but it was inevitable. So at that point, we can say we're now finished with this grand metaphysical scheme and moral scheme as well of the dual prophecies coming together in a final confrontation. But it's not a final confrontation in the sense that, and then they lived happily ever after. Rather, now a future and a single past lays open to them, in which there is still freedom and possibility. Not everything is predetermined, even though parts of things have been. And very fascinating, I would say, philosophical scheme explored here, which perhaps rereadings might make even more complex. I thought that one of the interesting literary, and we could also say philosophical themes if we're thinking about human nature and morality and ethics and personal development, one of the themes we should explore is that of character development. And it's too easy to focus on Gary, and we've already talked plenty about him. He's the chosen one. Great. And we could, in fact, talk about the development that is taking place not just of individuals, but of couples. We actually have quite a few that are changing, growing, developing over time. And we're going to come back to one of those as we conclude this. We could, mention Marek and Barak, right? Their love that develops. They're able to get over a sense of duty to each other. We could talk about Hetar and I'm blanking on her name and the revelation of the love that they have. We could talk about the capacity for the queens to take charge in the absence of their husbands, but because of their husbands and their decisions actually being sort of ratified by them, they made the right decisions. And we could talk about the two sort of rather exotic people, the Ulgo and the Marak woman, eventually, developing something that it's talked about as something perhaps greater than human. But the character who I want to focus on the most is arguably the second most important character in the entire set of novels, and that is the young princess, Canedra, who is given a lot of space. There's quite a few chapters that are essentially point of view from her central narrative location. I've marked out a number of passages, but we probably won't be able to get to all of them. And what I want to show is how she is developing, changing, becoming something greater over time. And, this is quite interesting. We begin by taking up the story. She's been left with the Algos. So the Algo girls had pale skin, white blonde hair, huge dark eyes. Princess Canedra sat in the midst of them like a single red rose in a garden of lilies. They watched her every move with a sort of gentle astonishment, as if overwhelmed by this vibrant little stranger who had suddenly become the center of their lives. Right? She's living, as always, on the extreme outside of her skin. And it was a difficult time for the princess. She'd not really fully realized the implication of her unhesitating acquiescence to the command of all when he told her to remain behind in the caves while the others journeyed to Rock Cathol. For her entire life, she'd been at the center of the events, but here she was shunted into the background. She was not emotionally constructed for waiting, and the outbursts that scattered her companions like startled doves were at least generated by her enforced inactivity, right? She also makes many discoveries. She discovered the core of Algo life was religion, and that the moral and theme of all their stories was the duty of absolute submission to the will of all. Until Nedrin might quibble or even try to strike bargains with his god. Nedra expected it and seemed to enjoy the play of offer and counteroffer as much as did his people. The Algo mind, however, was incapable of such casual familiarity. We were nothing, the Gorum explained, less than nothing. We had no place and no God, but wandered outcast in the world until all consented to become our God. Right? It was very interesting. We're seeing that part of her development is living amongst people who are quite different to her, right? And she's reflecting upon that. Now, in Riva, right, we see this interesting set of discussions happening. So there's a prophecy that she's part of, and she's also got this duty to, show up like all the other princesses have, wait for a Riven king. No king shows up, then her life is her own. So she meets up with Garion, and he goes to rap on the door. Your Majesty, Canedra's maid, greeted him with a startled courtesy. Would you please ask Her Highness if I might have a word with her? So she says, Your Majesty, greeting him in an icy voice. And Garion says, something's bothering you. Would you like to get it in the open? Whatever Your Majesty wishes, she replied. Do we have to do this? I can't imagine what Your Majesty is talking about. Don't you think we know each other well enough to be honest? Of course, I suppose I'd better accustom myself to obeying Your Majesty immediately. And he says, what's that supposed to mean? And she says, don't pretend you don't know. Well, what it is she has to marry him because he's the Riven king. And then we get this very interesting exchange. You don't want to marry me. It was almost an accusation. I didn't say that. Then do you want to marry me? I didn't say that either, but it doesn't really matter, does it? We don't have any choice at all, neither one of us. Is that what's bothering you? Her look was lofty. Of course not. I've always known my husband would be selected for me. What's the problem then? I'm an imperial princess, Garion. I know that. I'm not accustomed to being anyone's inferior. Inferior to who? The Accord state you are the overlord of the West. What does that mean? It means, Your Majesty, you outrank me. So this is a sticking point for her. This is a problem, right? So we get this very interesting then resolution of the problem. The princess is, Her Highness Kenedra of the Tolnedran Empire is being granted an audience. So this is, being subservient in a certain way to the Riven king. And Garion says, I will receive her. She approaches the throne, and she says, okay, the Tolnedran Empire is fulfilling the obligations in the Accords of Omimbre, right? And Garion then says something interesting. And the quiet inner voice had suggested a way to head off years of marital discord. So he says, I, Belgarian, king of Riva, hereby consent to take the imperial princess Kenedra to be my wife and queen. I declare she will rule jointly by my side in Riva and wheresoever else the authority of our throne may extend. So he elevates her to equality by doing so. And that is going to be incredibly important. So we see that after Belgarian leaves, Polgara is extremely upset. Kenedra actually keeps her from destroying some beautiful things that she had. And then Kenedra comes up with a kind of plan while Polgara is still stewing, right? And, interestingly, we get this entire thing about the prophecy. And then there's a part of it that pertains to her. She is going to be raising an army, right? So she's also learned how to, essentially spy on conversations, and she's, steering things, slowly using all of her wit and wiles, and then she says, we're going to, I'm going to rule in Belgarian's stead. And she brings up this part of the betrothal document. And, there's some argument going on here. And eventually she's going to be called upon to do something. So they decide what they should call her. She is the Riven Queen, which is the entire title of that. And people start, saying, well, we should, decide on the protocol, what to do. And then she actually has armor made for herself so that she can, appear somewhat more martial, since she's going to be a bit of a figurehead. And then she has to do public speaking. So she asks Polgara, what are we going to do? And Polgara says, not we, Kenedra, you. You're going to have to talk to them. I'm not very good at speaking in public, Lady Polgara. Crowds frighten me and I get all tongue-tied. You'll get over it, dear. She looked at the princess with a slightly amused expression. You're the one who wanted to lead an army, remember? Did you think that all you were going to have to do is put on your armor, jump in the saddle, shout, follow me, and the whole world would fall in behind you? Well, you spent all that time studying history and you missed the one thing all great leaders had in common. You must have been very inattentive, Kenedra. It doesn't take much to raise an army. You don't have to be brilliant. You don't have to be a warrior. Your cause doesn't even have to be great and noble. All you need is to be eloquent. I can't do that, Lady Polgara. Well, you should have thought of that before, Kenedra. It's too late to go back now. Rodar will command the army and see to it all the details are taken care of, but you're the one who will have to make them want to follow you. And so she overcomes her fear of public speaking and begins giving these speeches all over. And, she's like, well, I've done one. And then Polgara is like, you're going to have to do a whole bunch of them. And then we get to another very, very interesting incident where she is going to effectively take her father, the emperor's legions. She has an audience with her father. She knows that her father is prone to fits if he gets angry enough. She manages to anger him, and then she goes marching out to the legions. She says, I need time to talk to them. The fit won't really hurt him much. He's had fits all his life. So what does she do? She tells a story. She takes a different approach. She is learning how to be essentially not just a ruler, but a leader, and steals, in some respect, his legions, her father's legions from him, which will be an integral part of the army. Now, much, much later, we read this. The speeches were over. The orations that caused Princess Kenedra such agony had done her work. She found herself less and less in the center of things. At first, the days opened before her, full of glorious freedom. The dreadful anxiety that filled her at the prospect of addressing vast crowds of men 2 or 3 times a day was gone now. Then she became dreadfully bored, but then she is going to start thinking about, what she has gotten all of these people in for. And she's going to feel a deep, deep sense of responsibility. She's also going to reach out to Belgariad when Polgara has engaged in sorcery that has basically worn her out so badly that she won't awaken in order to save the armies and keep them from being destroyed. And Polgara is going to be awakened by a kind of medicine or drug or something like that. It was so acrid it made her eyes water, and she gets Polgara awake. And then they're going to be taken very shortly after that to Maloria. So we get a little bit more there as she's captured and being told by Zakath what his plans are. And interestingly, he tells her, how little you understand us, Kenedra. Tower Urgas was only the symbol of Murgar fanaticism. Krechik is now dead, and Tower Urgas is dead, but Murgardom lives on. Our enmity goes back for eons. And then she says, is it all for power? And he says, what else is there? When I was very young, I thought there might be something else. In time, you will discover the same truth. Your Belgarian will grow colder as the years pass, and the chill satisfaction of power comes more and more to possess him. And then we'll fight, us too, right? He says, go to bed and dream of love and other absurdities. The dreams will die away all too soon, so enjoy them while you can. Kenedra has an assessment of him, which shows wisdom on her part. He's every bit as insane as Tower Urgas was. He's so obsessed with the idea of becoming Overking of Angarak, he's not even paying attention to what we're doing. Now, in the end, Kenedra is not going to play a big role in the battle with Torak, but things are going to happen in the epilogue at the Isle of the Wind. And, she is now the Riven King. They are getting married. There's this, several page-long discussion of what's going on in this section. And I'm going to jump right to the very end. So she's asking, this is after they've done some dances, melancholy already, my husband? Once again, even as they sat, she ducked her head beneath his arm and drew it about her in that peculiar way of hers. She smelled very good, and he noted she was very soft and warm. I was just remembering a few things, he replied to her question. Good. Try to get that all out of the way now. I wouldn't want it interfering later. Garion's face turned bright red, and Kenedra laughed a wicked little laugh. I think that perhaps later is not much further off. You must dance with Lady Polgara, and I'll dance with your grandfather. And then I think it's time for us to retire. It's been a very full day. I am a bit tired, Garion agreed. Your day isn't over yet, Belgarian of Rifa, she said to him pointedly. They're going to consummate their marriage that night. And that is where at least this part of the story ends. But I do want to bring up, I mentioned there's one couple who I think is important to talk about a little bit. And this is, coming about through a kind of miracle. So Polgara is already mourning her love who has been lost, the smith, who is Dernick, the best of men, and there's the chance that he can be brought back to life. And Garion will be the one who actually does bring him back to life, but there's a bargain that has to be made. All, the father of the gods, and Alder are talking with her, and Alder says, "All men die, my daughter, the best as well as the worst in thy life. Thou hast seen this many times." She says, "Yes, master, but this is different." "In what way, beloved Polgara?" Aunt Pol bit her lip. "Because I loved him, master." "Is that so difficult to say, my daughter?" And then Alder asks, "Would you have us restore this man to thee, my daughter?" "That is impossible, master. Please don't toy with my grief like this." "Let us, however, consider it may be possible. Wouldst thou have us restore him?" "With all my heart, master." "To what end? What task hast thou for this man that demands his restoration?" "To be my husband, master," she blurted. And there's a decision that has to be made. So he says, "Art thou sure, however, that this love of thine derives not from thy grief, and that once this good man is restored, thy mind might not turn away from him? He is, thou must admit, most ordinary." "Dernick has never been ordinary," she flared with sudden heat. "Is the best and bravest man in the world." "I meant no disrespect, Polgara, but no power doth infuse him. The force of the will and the word is not in him." And he says, "Marriage must be a joining of equals, my daughter. How could this good, brave man be husband to thee so long as thy power remains? Could thou, Polgara, limit thyself? Would thou become his equal with power no more than his?" So then she says, yes. And he will be brought back to life, but there's kind of a twist, and it's a happy twist at the very end, right? He is going to make a beautiful thing for her. Dernick says, "I know how much you love beautiful things. I wanted to give you something like that too, only I can't work in glass or gemstones. I'm a metalsmith, so I have to work in steel." He produces a intricately wrought steel rose just beginning to open. "Why, Dernick," Aunt Pol said, genuinely pleased. "How very lovely." Pol thinks that she's lost her powers, by the way. Dernick did not give her the rose yet. "It has no color, though, and no fragrance." "Do it," Belgariad says to him, "the way I showed you." Dernick turned back to Aunt Pol, still holding the burnished rose in his hand. "I really have nothing to give you, my Pol, except an honest heart and this." He held out the rose in his hand, and his face took on an expression of intense concentration. He's doing sorcery. When Dernick finished, he held a living flower out to Aunt Pol, its petals beaded with dew. "How is it possible?" she asked in an awed voice. "Dernick's a very special man now. So far as I know, he's the only man who ever died and then lived again. That couldn't help changing him, at least a little." And then he says, "It does have one advantage. The steel is still in it, so it won't ever fade or wilt. Even in the middle of winter, you'll have at least one flower." And then he suggests, "I could make you others, a whole garden of them." So what is the story? Aunt Pol never lost her power. Instead, her once dead, now living husband, Dernick, has been given power so they can be equals. And she says, "Our master said," and Belgariad raised one hand, "if you'll stop and remember, Pol, all he really asked is if you'd be willing to limit your independence and marriage and go through life with no more power than Dernick had. Since there's no way he could remove your power, he obviously had something else in mind." And so this is a very beautiful place to end things. And I want to say, so I think that people who interpret this as, well, it's, a fantasy story and it's swords that dominate in the end. No, as we've seen also with the prophecy, it is love between people that winds up being one of the important, dominant themes, not just romantically, but we might say morally and metaphysically in this entire series. It leads to the development of peoples. The lack of love leads to problems. It's also what overcomes the evil Torak, a god who is brought to nothing. So this is a fitting place to end our discussion of the Belgariad, and maybe we'll do more Eddings down the line in the future.